We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving computer history and the history of the information revolution that most of us are a part of. We began as a spin-off of the Boston Computer Museum, dedicated to the historical mission of the Boston Computer Museum. As of the end of last year, we're now an independent organization. We're a California nonprofit corporation. The Computer Museum in Boston has closed, sadly, but the good news is that the exhibits from the Computer Museum in Boston, which were oriented toward teaching mostly kids about how computers work, are being moved into the Museum of Science. So the big virtual fish tank, and I think the big walk-through computer, and a bunch of others of the famous exhibits are moving into there, and that will be called the Computer Museum at the Museum of Science. The history-oriented mission is ours. We have moved the entire collection from Boston to here. They're stored through the benefaction of NASA in warehouses at Moffett Field. We keep asking them every once in a while for more warehouses because we're assiduously trying to expand the collection. The collection is now probably 50% bigger than what we got from Boston, and we continue to make it bigger. The good news is that computers in general are getting smaller. We went through this bubble in 1970 where the really big machines were there, and I think we've got all of those. So from here on in, we may have to get warehouses at a slower rate. Our dream is to establish a proper international museum of computing history. We have a 2-acre parcel allocated to us right next to the front entrance of the big dirigible hangar. The dirigible hangar itself, the plan is, will become an air and space museum, and that entire area of Moffett Field will become publicly accessible outside the security gate and be a collection of nonprofits and semi-public and public organizations. So it's going to be a very exciting development, which we look forward to. In the meantime, we keep ourselves busy expanding the collection, doing lots of other activities, including this lecture series. We've done this for now 4 or 5 years, and I think this is going to prove to be one of our most exciting lectures. The next lecture upcoming is going to be on April 13th. That's going to be Thomas Sterling talking about the first Beowulf cluster, and if there's a venue for that, I haven't been informed, so I'm not sure where it's going to be. We sometimes hold them on Moffett Field and sometimes hold them in other places. Other thing I should mention is that we have a small staff, but the museum is hiring. So if you're interested in looking at positions, for positions at the museum, look at our website, www.computerhistory.org. If you're interested in becoming a volunteer, please look there as well. There are lots of activities that we depend on our volunteers for. You can become a member of the museum. There are materials down in the lobby area for you to do that with. After this lecture, there's going to be a reception at the visible storage part of our warehouse. One of the reasons why we like to hold lectures at Moffett Field is because it's within walking distance of at least a large part of our collection that we'd like you folks to be able to see. So after the lecture, follow the crowd or follow the signs to the visible storage warehouse. We'll have some refreshments there, and you'll be able to see some of what we're collecting for ultimate display in the museum. I think that's all I need to say right now. This lecture on early computer crime is interesting because it certainly got a good reaction from almost everyone. I think there are 2 reasons for it. One is people's fascination with the history of computer crime, but also people's fascination with what's happening now. There was a Computer Security Institute report not too long ago that said that 90% of large corporations have experienced some breach in computer security. So it's a hot topic for present day as well as obviously a topic that started earlier on. It really gets people's emotions running because it's an area where there's an intersection of security issues, privacy issues, and freedom issues. And the tension between those issues sometimes causes people to polarize, and lots of people in this area have access to grind, which makes for an interesting session, and I think this session is going to be interesting on those grounds if no other. We have a luminary in the area of computer crime to run the show and to introduce the speakers. Don Parker has been working in the field of computers for 50 years. His original degree is in mathematics from Berkeley, but for 30 years he's been specializing in the fields of crime and computer security. He wrote one of the initial books in this field called Crime by Computer in 1976 and has kept on writing and studying and talking. His most recent book on computer crime is called Fighting Computer Crime, a new framework for protecting information, published in 1998. He spent many years at SRI Consulting, now called Dario Incorporated. One of these days I'll memorize that. and is now retired, or semi-retired, because I think he's keeping as active as he was when he was not retired. Please welcome Don Parker.
Thank you very much, Len, for that nice introduction. Our subject this evening is really a funny subject. I mean funny subject. It is so funny I spend a lot of time crying about it. It's a weird subject. We all love the problem. We love computer crime. I mean, everybody loves the bad things that other people do. We're fascinated by it. We put a lot of humor into it. And the subject of doing something to solve the problem, everybody hates. I mean, is there anybody in here who does not hate security? Especially when you came through the gates to get in here tonight? Everybody hates security. I hate it. The panel hates security. And again, that's another reason why we hate security. Well, this very weird subject, filled with people we call black hats and people we call white hats, and the white hats go to the black hats conferences, and the black hats go to the white hats conferences, and then all the people on both ends try to claim that they are gray hats. Actually, I think they're more checkerboards than they are gray, but it is a weird, funny subject. And I've been dealing with this, fighting the war on computer crime for about 30 years. And it really is a war, and those of us in security need to remember that we're in an army defending our organizations from a real, live enemy. And I've spent a good deal of those 30 years chasing the enemy around, interviewing them, trying to find out what makes them tick, find out what they did, why they did it. And the research of this type is extremely important, and there's hardly anybody involved in it. The first or the definitive book on this subject came out in 1976. And the first computer crimes I have recorded in my files anyway started in about the late 1950s. At the same time computers started, you're going to find where there are people, there is evil. And so the research in doing this kind of thing is extremely important. And it all started, for me at least, back in 1969, and the first report that Susan Nickham, an attorney in Palo Alto with Baker and McKenzie, and I ran around the country finding computer criminals to interview. And we found that interviewing them, in fact, in prison cells was the best place. They were bored out of their minds and very eager to spend some time, stimulating time, talking to us. So it is a funny subject. But over these years, we've tried to document these findings and try to come to conclusions how we can use this information to defend our information, ourselves, and our organizations. Just to give you a sample of the kind of things that we can conclude from studying these crimes that go way back to the 1950s. 4 little points that I'll mention and then introduce the panel to get their views on this as well. First of all, the motives of these people are really pretty fascinating. Most of the news media and the law enforcement organizations would tell you it's greed and high living. And throughout the research that we've done, we find that is absolutely not true. It is unshareable, intense personal problems. And sitting in prison cells talking to these people, they are not criminals, they are problem solvers. And those are the people that we have to deal with. Now, of course, they are very different. The embezzlers, and the spies and so forth are very different than a totally new kind of enemy we have to deal with, the malicious hackers. And the malicious hackers are very, very different kind of criminals. I find, and I've interviewed over 200 computer criminals, and about half of those were malicious hackers. And I found that these are fascinating people to work with because, primarily, they enthusiastically lie, steal, deceive, exaggerate, and they do it with great glee and without any remorse at all. That makes them very different people from you and I, who also do these same things, but only on an exception basis under great stress. And we do feel guilty about it afterwards. The hackers revel in lying, stealing, cheating, and in deceiving. And getting the information you need from them makes a fascinating discourse. The third point that I want to make here is very important, and that is the techies in our field, information security, they think of the functions of detection, prevention, and recovery. Well, there are two other functions that are at least as important as those three. And those additional two functions are avoidance of the endangerment of information. And endangerment is not even on anybody's list. Actually, it is on the list of a couple of people. John Deutsch, the ex-director of the CIA, for example, and Dr. Lee at Los Alamos have a rather intense interest in endangerment, since they are looking at the possibilities of punishment for endangering the information in their care. Endangerment is extremely important. The avoidance of endangerment and the deterrence of computer crime are, as I say, at least as important as prevention, detection, and recovery. And finally, let me make one last point here, and that has to do with predictability. My grandfather was convicted of bank fraud. In 1912, his crime was discovered, in fact, on the same day the Titanic sank, in Winnebago, Minnesota. I won't go into the details, but I didn't know my grandfather, but I studied that case very intensely. And I found something extremely important by looking at that case, and that is the critical importance to criminals of being able to predict the environment and circumstances of their crime. If they cannot predict that, they will fail in their crime or they will be caught. And then I studied all the 200 cases that I'd been studying over the last 30 years and find most of them involve this element of predictability. The enemy, the criminals, have got to have predictability. That's why they like computers so well, because computers are repeatable and will do exactly the same thing under exactly the same circumstances every time. And that's very important for computer criminals, especially technologist type of criminals engaged in developing viruses and DDoS, denial of service attacks, and so forth. So, predictability. Then if you turn it around, if this is what they fear the most, is unpredictability, obviously what we need to do is introduce the concept of unpredictability into our safeguards and our systems the bad guys are going to attack. So we need to design our safeguards and our systems so that they are unpredictable for abusive and misuse activities, and make them, of course, predictable for the good guys, the users. That, of course, is very simple in some ways, but gets very complex very fast. which is maybe why we haven't delved into it any further. But that is an extremely important finding and important for us in developing more effective protection of our information through systems in particular. Okay, well, I'm not the only one involved or studying the subject of computer crime, and I think it's time to hear from others on this subject as well. We have a very distinguished panel this evening. Unfortunately, Cliff Stoll has not yet appeared, and we hope that he may, since he was planning to be the clown for the panel. Anybody who knows Cliff knows that we would have that role filled very well. But let's get into here and take a look at our other panelists. First, Whitfield Diffie, a distinguished engineer, that's his title, at Sun Microsystems. And Whit is going to talk about crime, what crime? And he's going to cover the political and social policy issues, I believe, of computer crime, taking a guess from what he has written. And the second speaker, John Markoff, a distinguished technology journalist with the New York Times. And John is going to talk to us about avoiding the computer crime journalist beat. And I don't know how he's going to do that because the subject of his talk is Kevin and me. I can't imagine which Kevin he might be talking about. Kevin Paulson or Mitnick, but maybe it doesn't matter. And our third speaker is Peter Neumann, who is a principal scientist at SRI International. And I think it's always interesting to mention about Peter that he has 2 PhDs, one in physics and one in mathematics, which qualify him very well for this funny subject that we deal with. Peter is going to talk on the evolution of security and relating it to computer crime. His talk is What's Really Happening? And so with that introduction, I will turn it over to our panelists, each one spending about 20 minutes to give their presentations, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Peter.
Thank you. In case you believe that Whit was up first, I'm Peter Neumann. I'd like to take sort of a historical perspective of the future. This being a history museum. And in particular, I'd like to look at how we got to where we are and make a few observations on where we might be going. If you try to go back, as Don has, and figure out where the origins of computer crime were, we have a lot of things like phone phreaking and insider bank manipulation and stuff like that go back way back into the 40s, 50s. Of course, bank fraud has been around for centuries. Credit fraud, which is now something on the order of 0.7% of gross worldwide. Of course, they just jack up your fees and your interest rates, and nobody loses. This is a decidedly win-win situation. The guys who are doing the fraud are winning big time. You're not losing anything because you're indemnified. And the banks and the credit card companies aren't losing anything. Wonderful business model. Now, how do we do that in relation to computer security? Well, historically, there have been some very venerable examples of constructive hacking. Robert Morris, the internet worm in 1988, he was very hard he was trying very hard to demonstrate how vulnerable the ARPANET was at the time. And he really had no intent to bring the whole thing down. Dan Farmer, who's sitting here, is another example of I think a marvelous example of a constructive hacker. Mudge and the guys at Loft, who some people believe are evil. They testified right after me for the Senate a year or so ago and said, oh yeah, we can bring down the entire internet worldwide in 30 minutes. Piece of cake. The senators, Thompson and a couple others, got rather interested in that. They said, is that really possible? And the answer is yes, it's really possible. Now, when we're confronted with operating systems that don't even need hackers, bad hackers, they're falling apart all by themselves. When we're confronted with network technology where you may be using good crypto, but it's embedded in such a way that it's trivial to break, the network protocols are inadequate. When you're dealing with all of this, whether you're talking about Robert Morris pointing out that there are a bunch of flaws, some of which still exist today, 12 years later, when you're talking about the Loft guys saying they can bring down the entire internet, you have to think back to where we came from. There have been some intriguing cases that law enforcement would say were criminal activities. Now, you have to remember that law enforcement, by and large, believes in building more jails and arresting more hackers, and that is the solution to the computer crime problem. Somewhere along the way, there needs to be a realization, as Don has already suggested, that we need better systems. We need operating systems that have some meaningful security in them. We need some networking protocols that are properly implemented, that in fact are much more robust. So here we are with the paradox, if you will. If you demonstrate that a system is flawed, you may go to jail. And yet, when you try to call attention to the fact that these systems are vulnerable, nobody wants to listen. This is a very strange situation to be in. And it puts all of us, I think, in an awkward position, whether we happen to be a black hat hacker or a white hat hacker or a researcher trying to develop better systems. Today we have the Uniform Code, the UCITA activity, which just passed the legislature in Virginia. This makes reverse engineering illegal. It strongly endorses proprietary software. Open source is evil. Free software is evil. This is very dangerous. This is an extremely dangerous piece of legislation. And it's starting to work its way through the state legislatures. So the mass market is extremely slow to understand what the issues are. Law enforcement believes it can control it by arresting more of you, those of you who are perceived as evil people. The open source free software movement is viewed as heresy by a lot of folks, although many of the developers are in fact getting into it. And then we look back at some of the cases that have pointed out to us how vulnerable we are. Back in 1960s, there was this grade-changing episode at Stanford where somebody got into the computer and monkeyed around with the course grades. Back in the early 60s, CTSS at MIT, the compatible time-sharing system, attempted to isolate one user from another. One day, the password file came out as the message of the day. And the reason was that the guy who had designed the editor had never anticipated the fact that two people might be editing in the same directory. And he'd used fixed names for the temporary files, which got crossed over. So here's a case where it's not just hacking and cracking, it's the system falling apart all by itself. There are a couple of other examples. The one that Jean Mia likes is the Caltech versus MIT Rose Bowl scoreboard story in, I think it was the 1984 Rose Bowl. where the Caltech kids they spliced their way into the controls for the scoreboard. And this score was Caltech versus MIT instead of USC, Wisconsin, or whoever it was. And of course, the guys shut down, the controllers shut down the scoreboard immediately, and they wanted to charge these guys an enormous amount of money for repairing the scoreboard. There was nothing that needed to be repaired. The prosecutor in the Morris case wanted to soak Morris for tremendous amount of damage. And he was insisting that Morris had exceeded authority. Now, some of you have heard me say before that there was no authority required in the send mail debug option, the finger daemon, the .r host mechanism, and copying an encrypted password that was not protected. So the whole concept of how do we view constructive hacking as an enterprise that is designed to make our systems better, which is falling on deaf ears, leads us to the conclusion that there are great risks in being a whistleblower. There are great risks in trying to get people to listen who should be listening. Certainly in the case of John Deutsch versus Wenho Lee, which Don has thrown into the fray here. What John Deutsch was doing is said by the CIA to be harmless because he was merely copying top secret documents out of his laptop and letting his kids use the same laptop to surf the web for porno or whatever else they were doing. And this is perfectly fine. Whereas Wenho Lee at Los Alamos was copying the stuff onto his laptop because they were about to change all of the systems and there was no backup, and everybody else was doing it. A strange paradox in who's the computer criminal in this case. I'm not suggesting that John Deutsch is a criminal. I'm merely suggesting that the issues are not black and white. And the concept of the gray hat hacker is precisely the analog here. So I'm known for going on at great length. I'm not going to. Let me just say that the notion that Don already threw out, which is that we really need better systems and better networking and better network protocols. We need better education. We need sysadmins who know what they're doing. We need systems that are not dependent on thousands and thousands of systems. This sysadmins across the world to try and keep everything in order. These systems should be maintainable because they're designed properly. This is the old story of if you look at aviation disasters, the airframe manufacturer always blames the pilot. It's always pilot error. And we've got cases where the system was designed in such a way that the pilot never had a chance, because in a time of crisis, the human interface was not very usable. A simple example is the case of John Denver. The controls on his fuel levers were something, I think it was up was both tanks off. This direction to the right was the left tank, and down was the right tank. Now, this is hardly intuitive, and I don't believe he'd flown in that system, in that airplane, enough to realize that his fuel controls were very badly designed. So the answer from the FBI point of view is, hey, yes, we blame the hackers, we build more jails, we arrest more hackers, and that'll solve the problem. The mass market software producers say, well, nobody wants security anyway. It's going to cost too much, and they don't want to pay for it. And besides, nobody wants to administer it because it's so complicated, and it requires a tremendous amount of infrastructure to deal with. Somewhere between those two extremes is a happy medium, which says, let's build better systems. Let's make them self-administering as much as possible. Let's make them able to detect the fact that the systems are not very secure. Final comment, way back in 1965 when we did Multics at MIT Bell Labs and Honeywell, we solved a lot of problems that still haven't been solved by some of the vendors today. We actually solved the year 2000 problem in 1965 on Multics. We recognized it and we used a clock algorithm that didn't expire in the year 2000. But the point is that in the research community, there is an enormous amount of good stuff that is there and it can be used. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge in the community. Let's use it. And Cliff has arrived, so I will stop. You're here. How are you, buddy?
Hi, Cliff. I guess I won't be able to tell my Cliff stories. So, you know, I'm sort of in the current affairs business, and so tonight this is about history, and I was just thinking and listening to Don Parker, where is it where current affairs end and history begins? And I don't think I have a very good answer to that, except that his history is very different than my history. And when I was thinking about this beforehand, I had sort of sketched out these three generations, and I realized I'm missing about half of the world. But for me, history sort of started in 1980, and I was going to start from there and sort of try to build my worldview of what's happened in the 20 years that I've been covering computing in Silicon Valley. You know, for me, actually, I wanted to sort of gauge the audience just for my own interest to see who I'm talking to. Because for me, what really was ground zero was an article in Esquire magazine that I read in 1971, although it took a while to sink in, and it was called The Secrets of the Little Blue Box. It was written by Ron Rosenbaum, and I actually think it's sort of one of the most readable and best technology articles I've ever read, and it really holds up well over time. And that introduced me to a world that I didn't know, and I think it introduced a lot of other people to a world that they didn't know either. So what I wanted to know is, how many of you learned about phone phreaking from The Secrets of the Little Blue Box? Yeah. So a small number. Now the other question I wanted to ask is, how many of you knew about phone phreaking before The Secrets of the Little Blue Box? So I thought so. That's what I thought I was dealing with. But for me, that you know, sort of the three generations I wanted to sketch out, that was sort of a touchstone. And you know, we were clearly we started in this analog or mechanical world, and you know, the individual who was sort of the central figure for me in that article was John Draper, aka Captain Crunch. And I'd like to report to you, since some of you may not know it, that Captain Crunch is alive and well and living in Fremont. He's really bounced all over the world. I mean, I sort of find him a remarkable person in many ways. He's sort of like the Zelig of the computer industry. He shows up at every important juncture. You know, he's deeply into open source. He's also, I think, next Friday on his way to Israel to participate in some hacker conference. I think hacker in the sense that we all worry about John getting involved in. But he's convinced that they've got a big rave scene there, and he's a big raver, and so John is going to dance. I spent an evening with him just a couple weeks ago, and an evening with John Draper is still a very unusual experience. But you know, it was Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs who read that article written by Ron Rosenbaum, like I did, in 1971, and they set out to find John Draper. And you know, they looked around for a while, and they finally found him. And Jobs tells the story of sitting in Woz's dorm room at Berkeley after they talked on the phone, and Draper comes into the room, and he cocks back his head, and he says, "It is I." And you know, he passed on the blue box technology to Wozniak and Jobs, and they went into business. And luckily, you know, the Homebrew Computer Club came along, and Jobs, after a while, figured out that personal computers were a more lucrative market than blue boxes. And so they shifted over. But there was that juncture, the juncture between the phone freak community and the rise of the Homebrew Computer Club, or the creation of the Homebrew Computer Club. Draper tells a story. He was actually in a phone booth. He went to jail 3 times for his phone freaking activities. And one of those times, he was actually set up by an informer in Menlo Park when he was in a phone booth across the street from the People's Computer Company. He feels that time was really unfair. As a matter of fact, I have a picture of John Draper riding an elephant on the Goa coast in India, where he went as an HTML coder for a while. And he's had this really remarkable life. So there was this phone freak to PC transition, and I sort of showed up in 1980 and 1981 writing about this stuff. It was actually, Les Ernest was the person who introduced me to the ARPANET and sort of blew my mind by showing me a 1200 baud modem, and I became sort of fascinated with this world and began looking around. There was this bulletin board community emerging at that time. Most people didn't have access to the net. And I, like a bunch of other people, stumbled onto this homebrew bulletin board in Santa Clara called 8BBS. And I think 8BBS is another one of those touchstones. And it was operated by a DEC computer technician whose name is Bernard Klatt. And Bernard, I think, was Canadian. And he'd written the software in PDB-8 BASIC, and he had one 300 baud modem. And if you went to that bulletin board, you discovered that there was a very emphatic banner when you went in, committed to the freedom of information. And because of that, 8BBS had attracted an eclectic crew, I think you'd have to describe it at best. And this was the predecessor to chat, and people were exchanging a variety of information about illegal things, by and large. And so what happened was that because there was only one modem and you had to wait in line and share this thing, some kids from Philadelphia thought they'd speed up things by shipping him a 2400 baud modem. Unfortunately, the 2400 baud modem was bought with stolen credit cards. And because of that, when Bernard was on vacation one week in Canada, an interagency telco task force showed up. Santa Clara Sheriff's Department, Pac Bell et al. Took his door down with a fire axe and carted away the PDP-8. And that was the end of 8BBS. But one of the groups of people who was spending time on that bulletin board was a group of young people in Southern California referred to as the Roscoe Gang. And a number of colorful characters in the Roscoe Gang. I won't talk about all of them, but one of them was a woman by the name of Susan Thunder, who spent her time working in a massage parlor as well as hacking. She later at one point showed up on Geraldo and described how she would sort of social engineer military officers out of their passwords by sleeping with them and then going through their wallets. Susan is still around somewhere. But there were a series of flame wars, and at one point Susan turned state's evidence and some people were arrested. They had actually done a great deal of damage to a machine run by the U.S. leasing company in San Francisco. And it was one of those moments, but it was still a period of innocence. It was before the movie War Games. And War Games is another one of those sort of watershed events for me, because I think before War Games, the word hacker meant one thing. And after War Games, the word hacker forevermore meant something else to the popular mind. And it also, War Games, I think, set a bit in popular culture, if you will. It sort of glamorized the activity of illegally entering computers, and it mythologized it. And I think it had a lot to do with the culture that emerged during the 80s. So for me, the next point of note was the internet worm. And I sort of think of the internet worm as the point in time where we sort of lost our innocence. I have a slightly different view of it than Peter. I wish I could think that Robert Tappan Morris was doing constructive computer security work, but I think it was more Kilroy was here. You know, he wanted his processes to be running all over the internet, and he just made one tiny error. You know, instead of 1 in 7, if he picked 1 in a million, nobody would have ever noticed, but he picked 1 in 7. He was too clever by half, and I still don't think we have the entire story, but it's an interesting one because, you know, I think it probably was the internet's first distributed denial of service attack. Do you think that was true about the internet worm? The press went crazy. I mean, nobody even knew what the ARP was. And in a way, it was the internet worm that introduced the net to the American population. Nobody knew what it was before then. It was a wild day. The first day story in the Washington Post had 7 bylines on it. People thought that we were under attack, that this was a foreign power. All of these kinds of things were, it was very hard. There was sort of a fog of war mentality. On the second day, somebody called the national desk of the New York Times. I had only been in New York for half a year, and said that they knew something about the virus writer, and they wanted to talk to a reporter because they wanted to know what kind of trouble the person was in who wrote the program. And so they sent the call they sent the call to the Times medical reporter because they were talking about viruses. But they got that straightened out, and the call finally came to me, and we began to have this conversation. We had a series of conversations over a period of time, and this caller who came from the Boston area was referring to the person who'd written the program as Mr. X, and I had no way of telling whether he was telling the truth or not. And then at one point, he slipped, and instead of saying Mr. X, he said RTM. And of course, that's where Cliff comes into the story. I knew enough about Unix to know that it was probably a Unix logon. And in short order, between the two of us, we actually had a name. The name was Robert Tappan Morris, and we knew it was a Cornell graduate student. But I still didn't have a story, because you know, a name won't get you a story. This was Friday afternoon. And later in that afternoon, I got a call back from one of my sources. And in the government, I'd made a lot of calls, and one called back late on Friday afternoon. And I said to him, I think I know who wrote the program. And he said, who? And then I said, I'm not going to tell you, you're the government police, essentially. And we began to have this back and forth conversation. And it quickly became obvious that he knew more about what had happened than I did. And you can imagine me being on deadline trying to figure out what is going on, that this guy in the government knows more about this program that nobody knew about than I did. And we were about to hang up. I sort of thanked him, and I was just about to get off the phone. I said, well, that's strange. Your name and this name are the same. He says, it's not strange at all. It's my son. And then we had an interesting conversation because he wanted me to, Robert Morris wanted to persuade me to wait until Tuesday for the Times science section to run the story because the science section was his favorite section of the paper. And I told him I'd ask my editors. And then I called him back about a half an hour later to tell him I was sorry we were going to have to run the story that night. And he said, if I throw a dart, I can talk to you again, but if I throw a dart in any direction, I'm going to run into an NSA attorney. So we had a more limited conversation after that. So, I mean, you know, the Robert outcome was a good one because whatever his motivations, Robert, who was convicted and went on to serve community service and pay a fine, really got his life together in the most exemplary way. He's now had a successful startup, and he's a faculty member in the Laboratory of Computer Science at MIT. I'm not sure of this, but I showed up at MIT right after he did his thesis defense, and I believe Robert's thesis was on network congestion. Is that true? Which is, you know, rich with irony if it's true. So, you know, and that, so sort of quickly, the final era, which is I think the modern era, I think for me was sort of highlighted by a young man from St. Petersburg whose name is Vladimir Levin, who was part of a group of people who penetrated the production EFT system at Citibank several years ago, and you know, from St. Petersburg, and then were able to move a tremendous amount of money around inside the bank, and got some of it out before they were captured. The interesting thing about that story, aside from the fact that, you know, it's what I call, you know, probably the rise of the Willie Sutton era of computer crime, that, you know, the criminals have figured out where the money is that I think the mechanism, as has been described to me, was that there was an operational system and a prototype system. And I believe there were different rules on the prototype system than the operational system, and the two systems happened to be connected. And from reading the email of the engineers working on the prototype system, the Russians, and there are suggestions that this was renegade KGB or something. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but were able to get into the production system. So, so essentially in these 20 years that I've seen, you go from exploration to show me the money, essentially. And the first era was an era of testing boundaries. It became mythologized by war games. I think there was a lot to sort of the kids that I met. This was a response in the 70s to sort of the nature of suburban life in America. How can you have these kids were upstairs living kind of cloistered lives, living in suburban America, and they could be living a really remarkable life on some deck machine in Singapore and living out a fantasy. I mean, the book you still have to read to understand this culture is True Names, which was written by Werner Vinge, a computer scientist who, this was written at the point, trying to sort of extrapolate from bulletin board culture. He took, 8 BBS and added infinite bandwidth and infinite processing power, and he got True Names, where you have to hide your true name at all costs. And of course, almost nobody does a very good job of hiding their true name, is what we find in the end. So then you had this community emerge as a result of war game, which sort of aggressively asserted that trespassing was okay, and that was sort of the defining culture of the period. And so now we're in this period. This is where sort of my attempt to get off the computer crime beat, because I never wanted to be on the cop beat. You have guys like Maxis, another Russian, who's stealing credit card and running extortion scams. The net has become Main Street. It's no longer a technology story; it's a business story, and increasingly, computer crime has been normalized. And as a result, I think it's less interesting. Thank you.
Someone else told me not to say much tonight because I have either pneumonia or something else. So I'll try to talk fast and keep it quick. Since I only heard a few of the remarks so far, I ought to point out that I do know about phone phreaking. I go back in computing to the days of an IBM 1620. I programmed in assembler, SPSS, and even helped co-write a Fortran 2D compiler for it in 1620. When I was in high school, my high school was the first to have a 1620, no disk drive, but had a real cool executive style IBM printer on it, that typewriter that was absolutely neat. And I still know how to clear core 160000030, would move things across and clear the arithmetic tables. While doing that, I had a great deal of fun sort of fooling around with one of the compilers, which was sort of a Fortran style compiler, so as to cause the arithmetic tables to give wrong numbers, which I thought was really neat when I was 14 or 15 years old, that other students would try to run, I'd write programs for them to solve their chemistry homework and show them how I'd get the right answers, but somehow or another I'd throw a sense switch so they'd get the wrong answers. And I thought that was real neat when I was 14. Later on, at college, I was the technician to the electronic music studio at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and used to fix the Moog synthesizer. And this guy, Robert Moog, used to come up and help build stuff. He'd build stuff, and I'd be his technician. I'd be working next to Robert Moog, making these voltage-controlled oscillators that you'd tweak them 1 volt, and they'd move an octave. And it was really cool, and the guy was really smart and learned a lot of electronics. And the guy who lived down the block from me, Greg Flint, thought it was really cool that I knew all about oscillators. And he started talking about quarter boxes. Quarter box, what's that? And he said, I want an oscillator that every time you push this button, he goes beep, 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 beep. And he gave me the timing diagrams. And it was a photocopy out of the Bell Telephone Technical Journal. I said, oh, that's easy to do. And I wire up a couple capacitors and resistors and RC circuits and make this cool quarters box. And then I find out what he's using it for. He'd hold it up to a payphone and call. The weirdest thing is, it's not like Greg wasn't like going out making important phone calls. No, he'd go to the payphone, call Taiwan to find out what the weather was, and the operator would say, can you put like $5 in quarters in? So he'd go bleep, 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 bleep. It was weird, and I kept saying, look, this isn't the reason for learning electronics. This has nothing to do with the cool things you can do. And he and a bunch of others thought this was the niftiest thing, to take cool circuits and use them to steal other people's services, steal money from other people. There's a fairly trivial circuit that would allow people to call into your phone and never turn on the billing. It was a way of getting free incoming long-distance phone calls. So that it was bizarre stuff like this. And you know, I'd make one, say, oh yeah, it works, and then throw it away. And these guys would just go nuts about it, say, oh, I gotta have it. For what? So as to save like $1 of your parents' money, and it was just bizarre. So I always felt like I was on the outskirts of this. The technology I found intriguing, but the nature of using it to steal, to do things somehow or another. I always had this bizarre something up my back, this broomstick up my tail end that said, no, it's okay to have fun. It's cool to do things with things, but it's wrong to just steal things and break things and steal other people's things just cause. Well, okay, now fast forward into the future, skipping over to at any rate, one time or another in grad school. I'm not even going to talk about that time. And one time in grad school, I'm bicycling from Tucson, Arizona, over to see the very large array in New Mexico. And bicycle trip takes me to Albuquerque, and I just built, along with two other guys, in a small computer using an 8080 from MITS. And a friend of mine, this time you could make them out of kits. This friend of mine's working there, and he invites us over and say, hey, it'd be really cool to play around with this. You know, so I go over there, and he's repairing these things. It's sort of Heath kits, only it's single board computers or multi-board S100 computers. I'm over there, and this guy who's fixing them says, boy, these people are weird. In order to replace an unsocketed 16-pin integrated circuit, this guy had taken a propane torch and torched the bottom of it to loosen all the pins at once. And so I'm there, and we're fooling around doing all this stuff, and this guy who previously had been fooling around with quarters machines. So we're talking there at MITS and Albuquerque and things like this. I'm about to hop on my bike. You know, it's a 3-day ride back to Tucson. And I meet this guy, Bill Gates, in the hallway, who says, you know, I'm writing a basic compiler interpreter or something like this, and I want to help. And I think, it'd be kind of fun, but I'll go back to grad school instead. Which somehow or another is related to computer crime, but I'm not sure how. Anyway, finished up grad school and did a bunch of graduate work in radiative transfer and non-gray atmospheres and PDP-11s and Crays and CDCs and stuff like this. Anyway, I managed to bump around in computers and astronomy until somehow or another ended up at Lawrence Berkeley Labs in the mid-'80s, building optical surfaces inside of a computer for the world's largest telescope, the Keck Observatory, which is way, way, way more interesting than anything in computer crime, I might add. Anyone who thinks that it's real neat in computer hacking ought to seriously go and imagine designing a telescope that has 36 independently supported hexagons, each one at 1.8 meters across, each one an off-axis hyperboloid, and absolutely nifty. I mean, you want to see cool technology. Imagine supporting this mirror that's the size of that tabletop on 3 motors and having to step each one in step sizes of about 10 or 15 nanometers and having capacitive sensors on the side to figure out exactly where each one is to counteract any bending from the supports underneath it. Absolutely nifty stuff. On the other hand, after a while, the science and engineering started to take a back seat, and it was going ahead to be built. And so I looked around and said, I kind of need a job that keeps me in Berkeley because I don't want to move to Hawaii where the telescopes are being made, are being constructed. And so I went down to the basement of Building 50 at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, started working there, and 2 days into working at Lawrence Berkeley Labs Computing Center, one of the other guys, Dave Cleveland, comes up to me and says, you know, we got this problem with our accounting system. And he says, well, you're the new kid on the block. You're the local newcomer to the systems managers group. Why don't you see if you look into it and see what's going on? And I say, sure, this is kind of neat. Seems that they had the old policy was, let's see if we can get as much money as possible out of all the users at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And so they said, let's go and dock every time somebody uses any of the big computers, the PC, the mainframes, the VAXs, the big were then considered Big Sun workstations, Sun 2s. And we had just recently installed thick wire Ethernet all over the place, and we kept running sort of separate billing systems, the internal Unix billing system, but we had our own separate one. And we'd hired a couple undergraduates from University of California to build the database system that would keep track of who spent what money where. And I had just started working there, and this homebrew accounting system was dead in the water. It was floating there dead. And my job to figure out what it was. Didn't take long to realize that a ticket had come out over the ether from one of the Unix boxes saying that some user named Hunter had used about 75 cents or 80 cents worth of computer time, and that user Hunter did not show up in the database program. It turns out that they don't teach you error correction until your junior year at University of California. And so the thing crashed, and it didn't take long for me to figure out, that's how to fix it. So I'm there, and making a long story even longer, I'm sitting there saying, well, the problem is that this guy Hunter shows up in our Etsy password file. This was long before there were shadowed passwords. It was when Robert S. Morris had the brilliant idea in the late 70s, early 80s, that the way you want to protect passwords is through encryption and encryption alone. Don't keep them hidden. Just encrypt the passwords, and that's all you need to do. Brilliant idea. Unfortunately, it turned out that at least one or two of the crackers who were abusing our system were cracking this password file using dictionary attacks, which are well known to most of you, and those who don't know about it, you don't need to learn about it anymore because there's ways around it anyway. Where was I? Anyway, so I realized that someone was cracking or hacking into our system, fooling around with it. And I'm sitting in the back of this very, very boring lecture on galactic wave structure, and I realize, how's this possible to happen? I'm sitting in the back of the lecture, and I realize somebody must have root privilege to one of my Unix machines. I'm thinking, how's that possible? This is a weirdness. And remember, I'm how can I put it? I'm little folk. You're waving 10 minutes. 10 minutes for what? 10 minutes. So I'm little folk here. It's not like I'm brilliantly smart or anything about this stuff. I'm learning on my own as I'm going. It occurs to me somebody has root privilege. So we immediately had a choice of, should we crack down and nail the doors shut, or should we try to make it so that we understand what's happening? Well, our assumptions immediately were that Dave Cleveland, myself, and a couple other people, some extraordinarily smart and clever programmers, of whom I have the honor of taking credit for most of their work. We got together, powwowed for a bit, and said, well, let's find out who it is. I bet you it's some student on campus who's thumbing his nose at us. The obvious possibility is that it might be a student thumbing her nose at us, or that the student might not be on campus, or that it might not be a student. Never occurred to us. We figured all smart Unix jocks had to be on campus at UC. So we figured it would be a might cool thing to chase after them. So one late Friday afternoon, we had a modem bank then, a huge modem bank of 45, 50 dial-in ports, and X25 link, we had a butterfly VAX, an old device that connected us to what was then called the ARPANET. This is way back, there were stegosauruses around you'd had to hit over the head. We're 56 kilobaud connected to the ARPANET, which again would later become the internet, or was already. So we said this would be a cool thing to chase down. The problem then is, how do you find somebody? How do you see what's coming in? We want to see the traffic coming in and going out of our system. So what I wanted right away was 45 or 50 printers, not just display devices. I wanted a bunch of printers to print out all the traffic coming in and out. Fortunately, that wasn't that hard, because back in those days, it was commonplace to have, well, how should I put it? Back in those days, a 2400 baud modem was quite rare, unlike today when a 2400 baud modem is quite rare. So we got a bunch of 1200 baud deck writers. The first one from the one next to my desk, the second one from Dave Cleveland's, another one from Wayne Graves, this fantastically brilliant VMS jock. And we went around, Ray Particle, all these cool guys who were real smart. I borrowed them all, but after about an hour or so, you run out of friends to borrow terminals from. So I did what I learned in graduate school, namely, it's way easier to apologize later than to get permission in advance. Waited around till Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, got one of these lab carts and went around sort of liberating people's Macintoshes and PCs and deck writers from around the department. Went down to the basement of building. Computer crime? I'm talking about computer crime. Wait, is that not the subject? At any rate, one of the... So we set it all up. I had a thermos of hot minestrone soup, vegetarian, down next to me. I had a sleeping bag, unrolled it in front of this VAC 780, right next to a Sun workstation that had been rescued from the Civil War. And next morning, the assistant director of the department, this guy who not only had a beard, but he also had a tie, came by and he said, we're missing a bunch of things, missing a bunch of hardware from around the lab. And I called it all back and noticed that in the middle of the night, somebody had logged in, had gone out over our system, disabled our accounting program using a hole in a set user ID to root program, gone out over the ARPANET, broke into a military computer at the Huntsville Anniston Army Depot Redstone Missile Bloated Blitz Station, copied this data back over an X25 link to Lord knows where. And for the next 11 months, we were hot or cold or lukewarm on the trail of some hackers who ultimately turned out to be stealing military information and retailing it to the East German Stasi and the Soviet KGB for quite a few Deutschmarks, and which were converted along the way into cocaine and various other implements of destruction. I noticed that I have 5 minutes left to spout. And I've talked about a quarter of what I wanted to say. All of this I found to be revealing. It was one thing to see a movie about war games and be on the side of the little guy who's trying to upset everything. And it was quite another thing to be on the receiving end, where somebody is going through my personal information, printing out my resume, printing out my email, and copying it into someplace else, and to witness this on a printout in front of me. It was quite another thing to try to call the NSA, the FBI, the CIA, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, to try to get them to do something, and over again hear the response. That's an interesting problem you have there, son, but it's not my bailiwick. One of the things I learned early on is all of these organizations don't want to work. They desperately want to make it look like they're working, but they don't want to lift a finger. The way to get a response from the government is to present the answer and try to make it look like they discovered it. And so it took about 11 months and a great deal of work working with North American agencies and ultimately the German Bundeskriminalamt, the German Bundespost, and TimeNet and other groups to finally find that it was a group of German computer people who one of whom was heavily employed in computer security work during the day, and the evenings felt that it was a profitable and interesting hobby to break into other people's computers and steal information. And at trial, he came up to me in the middle of in the middle of his espionage trial in February 1990 and said, "Look, why are you prosecuting me? Why are you testifying against me? I can be thrown into jail." To which I answered to him in the same way I told my friend Greg Flint when I saw him fooling around with this quarters machine, something that was technologically sweet, so inviting and so nifty. My answer is, why, yes, of course it is technologically neat to do this. But I feel it is still dishonest to do so. And I might not know what's legally right and wrong about theft of telephone service, or legally right or wrong about theft of computer service, or right or wrong about theft of military and personnel information. But I do know when it strikes when somebody's trying to bend that broomstick that's up my back, I do know when something strikes me as being wrong, and it struck me then that this was wrong. That sooner or later, I had an identification with a community, not just a community of telephone users, but a community of computer users. It was a time when perhaps I knew maybe 0.5%, maybe 2% of the ARPANET users. But I identified with them, and I thought them to be at least my colleagues, if not friends. And I felt it wrong to be breaking in to these people's computers, not to mention the systems belonging to colleagues of mine doing science and physics. The age of innocence has passed. There's what was then a very, very obscure, poorly known technical system, the ARPANET, has evolved into the internet, which is a byline now for making money, for instant communications, for it's hard to find sentences that use the word internet without the word revolutionary in them. And for me, I still remember back to this age of innocence. And I think, yeah, it would be neat to recapture some of these times, some of these thoughts. But they're gone. They're gone as much as my days of programming on the 1620 are gone, my days in high school. And so what I find myself doing now is more and more spending time with my 4-year-old and my 5-year-old. Thank you very much.
A beard and a tie, no less. The nice thing about talking last is you get to write your talk while you're listening to the other people. And the bad thing about it is that you have to, because they say all the things you were originally planning to say. A while ago, a man named Chandler, George Washington University, called me up and said, I'm going to hold a meeting, and he named some various government people and policy people and so on to come, and you're invited with the authority to interrupt at any moment. A little like the Roman consul in miniature. And that never came off, but I wish that's what I had demanded tonight. I drove in the gate outside, and I saw the sign that said heightened security in effect. It was before I'd gotten inside before I realized this must mean they were watching for Kevin Mitnick. Maybe they're watching all of us. In any event, I thought I'd start with my list of comments that I wish I could have delivered in the middle of other people's talks. Peter talked about a day when the message of the day was the password file due to a screw-up in the editor. He failed to mention there was just a much more delicious threat to the password file in that system, it didn't give you cleared memory, or was it disk? Probably disk, memory of some kind, when you asked for memory. And furthermore, the password table changed every night about midnight, and the old one got chucked out, onto the list of available space. So right after midnight, you jack up a giant job, right? And now you probably have the password table somewhere in all the space you've allocated, but where is it? Well, it's very easy to find. You just search for yourself, right? You're in the password table, and so's your password. You search for those things. You find, so it gives you a reliable way of finding the password table just after midnight every night. So you're only 24 hours out of date. Password table changes fairly slowly. But I graduated from working on that system to working on what we believe is the world's largest blue box. We had a PDP-6 at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, and it was painted DEC blue, so we programmed it to make a few sounds. I had one little correction I wanted to throw in, which is that Cliff credited Robert Morris with encrypting passwords. That dates back at least to Wilkes at Cambridge in the 50s. I don't know it back any further than that. It was certainly done in Multics in the mid-60s. Okay. What I'm going to try to talk about, I'm not a great fan of the concept of computer crime. I don't really doubt its existence, but it seems to me that it does not usually seem to me to produce a very good analysis of the problems or of solutions. And a lot of the things I had intended to say in that respect are sort of already been said. I had planned to start out talking about there was an era, and in fact, Don has a very nice talk he gives about crimoids, and he describes all these phenomena, but there certainly was an era when people were being accused of theft of computer services for using their boss's computer for something else. And those accusations typically tended to be rather, their financial aspect tended to be rather generous. That is, the assumption was made that the computer was as valuable at every second as it was in the second when you rented it to the highest paying customer. And to my view, this was one of many, early came to my mind as an example, in effect, of twisting fairly standard legal concepts and concepts of ethics and values and so forth, merely to take something out of an arena where it had to be judged. Right? And remember, the policies about use of office equipment range vastly across organizations. At Sandia, the machinists would be fired if they tried to mill their own head, ahead from their cars during lunch. Whereas at Stanford, the machinists, many of them were encouraged to take outside consulting work in order to keep up with contemporary machining problems. Right? And lots of these things have vast ambiguities to them. And we look at the way judgments are made about these things. Some of the examples have come up tonight. Wen-Ho Lee versus John Deutsch. Wen-Ho Lee is in prison, and friends in Albuquerque tell me he is effectively being tortured. He's being kept from sleeping by having the lights on and things like that. John Deutsch, I was on a teleconference with him in Washington the other day. Basically still doing his job. They said they lifted his clearance. He said, I commiserated with him, said, don't worry, Whit. People, look at the crimes. The first family of internet security, I think, is the Morris family. And look at the crimes of the son and the crimes of the father. The younger launched the worm. Now, I think that was a very imaginative piece of work. But what struck me about it was that it had imagination without resources. I was working in an organization that had resources without imagination. Now that organization, Northern Telecom. And had we had the idea to launch the worm, it would never have had bugs in it when it went out into the field. We knew about captive networks. We had the resources to run things in environments where we could control them until we got them debugged. Now, suppose you add a third ingredient. Northern Telecom didn't have any particular malice toward the net, but somebody in the world might have. And I think it is very possible the first time we had seen a worm might have been, loosely speaking, from whoever the enemy of the day was, the KGB, Spectre, bin Laden, etc. And so I think that Morris the Younger did us, in fact, a tremendous favor. We failed to profit from that favor, and we've treated him rather badly. But he showed us the immense vulnerability of a set of resources on which we were becoming ever more dependent. Now, Robert Morris Sr. is seen entirely differently. Right? Robert Morris the Elder, they're not quite junior and senior. He was the chief scientist of the National Computer Security Center, and his legacy includes many things. One of them is the password encryption algorithm that is currently in use in Unix and by adoption in quite a variety of other systems. That has the effect of limiting passwords to 8 meaningful characters. I believe that if you look at break-ins on computers and in the network all over the world, you probably find no other single cause that accounts for so much vulnerability. Enough said. A few weeks ago, I was at a seminar at Stanford Law School on internet, cyberspace and the law, I think it was called. And one of the talks we had was from a lawyer from eBay who was talking about people who, as he viewed it, and he was fairly persuasive in his argument, were cheating. They sent out bots of some kind or other. They got into eBay, and they found out what the going prices were for various things were, and they could make use of that information in other locations. And he described both their technical and their illegal attempts to shut them down. In one of those, cases where you really wish you'd known it the day before, the very next day, Dave Farber put out on his mailing list reference to a press release about how the Justice Department was investigating eBay for antitrust for exactly this activity. So the point is, you're seeing there a tug of war. I can't tell you, he's fairly persuasive, but certainly the self-righteousness with which this lawyer talked about how E-Ray was being violated. And a similar self-righteousness on the part of the Justice Department press release on how eBay was being investigated because they were doing perhaps they were committing a crime. So why is it that I doubt the virtues of the criminal point of view about computer activities? Well, we are at a great turning point in the relationship between computers and communications and business. In the past, there were 2 major business channels. You had a negotiation channel, spoken, written, telephone, fax, things of that sort. And you had delivery channels, trucks, trains, ships. And on balance, if you look at it, you required much more security on the delivery channel, where valuable goods are delivered, than on the negotiation channel. Today, those 2 channels are being integrated. And they're being integrated because intellectual property is becoming a larger and larger phenomenon in our economy. And now you can go onto the web and you can purchase information and have it delivered down exactly the same channel over which you negotiated for it. And you can get entertainment, music, movie, videos, customer information, credit information, market research, all programs, all sorts of things. And the most important thing in security is the value. If you look at security of resources of any kind, the most important security issue is what the value concentrated in those resources are. So the impact of improving communications technology, improving computer technology, is to draw more and more value into the internet system. And that dominates every other consideration about security. Now, there's sort of basically two approaches to defense. One is deterrence by denial of objective. I mean, that's roughly what modern bank vaults do. People almost never break into modern bank vaults, and it's rare that they're arrested trying to, hit at them with a crowbar or something of that kind. That does happen. The other is deterrence by threat of retaliation. And there are people who favor each approach, and there are circumstances in which each approach is appropriate. There's a lot of mischief, I think, has been done by the Cold War and the nuclear standoff, because the notion of deterrence by threat of retaliation became very popular, and somehow over that process people forgot that we weren't threatening to blow the Russians up back because it was because it was the best thing that one could possibly do. We were threatening to do it because the only thing we knew how to do. And this is a domain in which I believe that there's a lot better hope for security measures, and that what I see as the knee-jerk reaction of groups who feel that their rights have been violated by some computer event get a law passed against it and think that will solve the problem. And to some degree, of course, it does ameliorate the problem, because a certain number of the people who would be threats to their systems are subject to U.S. law and are afraid of getting busted and do have sufficient resources that they could be fined or held to be liable or something like that, and will be deterred. But the problem is that we live in an era that began in the 1850s, 1840s, or 1850s, 1870s with the first international cables, and was vastly expanded by radio and the internet and the satellite communications and so forth, are just the latest round in it, in which borders are declining in many of their significances. They're still important in the world, but information moves in many paths beyond the control of borders. And so a classical architecture in which the military protect the border and the police protect the interior and the locked door protects the shop front is breaking down. And so we face two sorts of things. I have believed in, still believe in, and still argue for a good deal better localized defense. I think that we can improve the security of computer systems vastly, and that, so to speak, to remove the liability from the people who are really responsible for protecting their computer systems and so to speak, put it on to the law enforcement agencies and the people who might penetrate the computer systems, I think creates a false sense of security, because I think the deterrence will not work against many threats that are rising in the world. The other aspect of the environment that's coming up is the tremendous popularity of outsourcing. And what I'm about to say undercuts the first thing I was going to say. That is to say, my first point is a claim that we really know a lot about computer security primitives, so to speak, particularly in the cryptographic area, but certainly in some logical areas as well. Many of the mechanisms I know in that way are bypassed by a trend in the modern world, beautifully exemplified by something Dertouzos, head of the Laboratory for Computer Science at MIT, said at RSA 2000. He said, doctors in India will work so cheap that doctors in the US send them recordings of patient interviews, and the doctors in India transcribe them, right, and email back the transcriptions. Now, you could encrypt the sending of the recording. You could encrypt the email coming back. What would that do to protect the patient privacy? You're sending something off into a whole different legal system, probably has effectively very little protection. And currently, many people are working to allow you to outsource all sorts of computing activities. So I think I have the strongest feeling both that we know how to do computer security and that not having done the homework we knew how to do so far, the world has already caught up with us and we have entered a world where we don't. Finally, we have a tug of war going on between things that can be claimed to be criminal on one side and things that can be claimed to be people's rights on the other. There was something I didn't take very seriously, once again on Dave Farber's mailing list a couple of days ago, talking about how you might be prosecuted for reverse engineering and defeating a new Disney Tarzan that won't let you skip its ads. Now, I read that a little more carefully. I read beyond the article. I don't think that this particular one is very significant. Let me close with this one. I think, in fact, that push and shove will come up at some point. Imagine the following. Security is a word that codes for legitimacy. Right? So here are two people, both of whom can say they're practicing security. Somebody is sending you a first-run movie or something to your TV, right? And they say, you know, we're going to be absolutely sure you can't buy, but the ads are the way you're paying for this. So we're going to make it as inconvenient for you as possible. We have a right to make it inconvenient for you not to watch the ads, right? So we have measures, whatever those might be, for preventing you from videotaping it or something like that. And they would be, I think, very self-righteous about that. Some of the watchers would be parents. The parents would say, we want to preview everything our children see. Right? They would think it was a matter of family security to have that level of control, to not have everybody's bare eyeballs up against the screen. So, 2 minutes. I thought I only had 6 minutes ago. This is internet time. There are a bunch of other examples of this kind of tug of war going on. There's a man named Serge Humpisch who penetrated European smart card system, was poo-pooed when he said he had, was asked to demonstrate, gave a perfectly innocuous demonstration, and was then busted in an attempt to keep him from embarrassing the people who had done it, built the system. And the current two cases being fought are the reverse engineering, something that was traditionally allowed in American industrial law, of first the DVD protection system, and then maybe more acutely the cyber patrol system, which is another of these things intended to protect kiddies from growing up. So, go ahead, think of computer crime. I think when you look deeper, you will find that many instances of computer crime are merely instances of somebody having succeeded in demonizing one set of interests versus his own. So thank you.
Well, I told you we were going to get some very different perspectives of the computer crime problem that we are addressing this evening. It's question time, and we would like to have people from the audience who would like to ask questions of our distinguished panel to come down and use this microphone to do so, since we are recording this whole session. And I'm going to prime the pump here for a moment and take the privilege of asking the first question, which may be kind of a bottom line type of question, but it seems like we're on the ledge that is getting narrower and narrower, and we have a choice where the whole culture of the internet and the commercialization is going to fall on the side of safety, of orderliness, and honesty, and that there will be enough security and enough honest people who will make commerce on the internet successful. And we'll still have a growing amount of crime, but as with credit card fraud that Peter mentioned, there's like 0.7%, and that's acceptable, and it makes it a viable, economically viable system. Fall off on the other side of the ledge, and we fall into chaos, and we fall into degeneration, and we fall into a situation where e-commerce is actually going to fail, and it's not going to work. Now, with 300 million people currently using the internet, which is the latest number that I've read, in all of the different cultures, there's no hope that there will be a single cohesive culture. That means there will be many, many thousands of value systems all functioning within that same framework. Is this going to degenerate and fall apart, or is it going to come together in some way enough to allow the successful continuation of commerce? Are we going to be enabling commerce with security, or are we going to fall behind and failure? So my question to the panel is, can you come up with a very quick answer or prediction based on how the history of computer crime has gone to decide whether we're going to fall on one side or the other side of this issue?
Don, I think it's kind of a sawtooth phenomenon. If you look not at the credit card business, but the cell phone business, cell phone fraud was getting up over 5% at one point, and suddenly they discovered that maybe it was worth putting a little technology into it after all. The credit card folks haven't gotten to that point yet because it's not a problem. I think what happens is that you start building fences where it hurts. And I think electronic commerce is the thing that's going to drive a lot of organizations to use cryptography and maybe some sensible operating systems where they've never had that incentive before. So on one hand, cell phones are still vulnerable. It's just that the level of attack has gone down a bit because they threw in a little sideband stuff. But they're still vulnerable. Now, when the fraud builds up to a point that it's really hurting, somebody might say, well, then it's worthwhile doing something about it. But I think the problem today is that people are making so much money irrespective of the fact that there's not enough security, that it doesn't matter. And we've said for years that it's going to take some major disaster, but we've had minor disasters, and it doesn't make any difference. There are people who are still running with the send mail debug option on, with their .r host stuff radiating to the world without their realizing it. And it's just the level of ignorance, obliviousness, stupidity, and other related factors is enormous. So someday, Whit mentioned outsourcing. There is a strong attempt in the government, particularly in the military, to outsource all of the system administration. I'll let you think about that one for a while.
I think there is no question that e-commerce has succeeded and is simply going to continue expanding. I don't know the exact rates or exactly what it will look like. But I think the question, I don't know the answer to it, that we should ask in response to your question, Don, is, are the crime rates that we're seeing currently, and I doubt that the definition of the crimes is going to make a lot of difference to this, how do they compare with crime rates in successful economies in the past? And it's just my conjecture that you're going to find that, you look at piracy on the Mediterranean during the Roman Empire, and there was a lot more at stake, and nonetheless there was an exploding economy, that people just plain will take risks. It also deserves to be said that the criminal component of the economy is not often, adequately understood. And so if somebody comes to your house and steals a TV, the poor thief sells it to a fence for $50, right? But that's not the significant economic impact. The police, you know, a couple of squad cars worth of police come and investigate, and they're costing hundreds of dollars an hour with their equipment and so forth, and they get paid. An insurance investigator comes and gets paid, and a locksmith comes and repairs your door and gets paid, and an insurance adjuster comes and looks things over and pays you, and you go buy a new TV set for $500 and so forth. So the total economic impact is several $1,000s, only a tiny fraction of which was being made by the criminal. Most of it was being made by legitimate people.
But the cost in what you've described,
I'm really describing a fact. I mean, that's...
I'm sorry, I see a different cost, not an economic one, but the cost, the emotional cost of the person whose house or perhaps even database was broken into.
Oh, I fully agree, and I'm not arguing.
cost of the TV
I'm
set
not
is
arguing
trivial.
we should value the thefts for their contribution to the economy. I am
I
arguing that
misunderstood,
something
I'm
that
sorry.
is structural in the economy this way is not something that's likely to go away.
The reason for the response is not to recover the value of the television, but rather to ensure some form of, dare I say, Western justice, whatever that means.
Just a couple of data points. I'm of the camp that things are going to get much worse before they get better. And a couple of data points. In reporting on CD Universe and talking to the CEO of CD Universe, his worst business problem was the fact that he had to map out entire countries because of the high incidence of fraud. And you know, without going into which countries they were, there were whole areas of the world, whole nations in the world where 90%, this is a mid-level, small to mid-level e-tailer, you know, 90% of the transactions from an entire country were fraudulent. Another data point, I believe in this most recent quarter, Expedia, which is one of the, you know, the bright spots in the internet commerce, I think took a charge of 3/4 of their profit for fraud. That's a stunning number to me, and I'm surprised it hasn't drawn more attention than it has. But you know, that's the mainstream. That's the heart of the business. They almost lost their entire profitability in the last quarter.
We have a questioner, but let me throw in one more comment, that there is a really important risk here that is widely under-realized, and that's the identity theft problem. The use of social security numbers and your mother's maiden name and stuff like that as authenticators. This is increasing radically in my book and in the online website, the Risks Archives. You'll find that the number of cases of this are increasing dramatically.
Okay?
Okay.
Let's have our first...
Yeah, my question is for John Markoff. First, I'd like to start by saying I enjoyed your talk entitled Kevin and Me, which didn't mention Kevin at all. I hope it's the beginning of a trend.
I think that was intentional.
I look forward to more talks like that. Yes, it's fitting and perhaps ironic that we're at the Museum of Computer History talk when I can think of no other individual who has done more to obfuscate that history. Your July 4th, 1994 article on Kevin Mitnick contained many things which you now must know are false, such as his break-in or alleged break-in to NORAD, which never happened, and other things which have now been repeated for the last 6 years in the media as fact, when we all know they are all or not. My question to you is, why haven't you issued a retraction, and do you still stand by those claims, as you said to Ziff Davis recently?
Is this an audience or a lynch mob?
Kevin couldn't be here to defend himself, so.
Well, I knew this question would come up. I really don't have a lot to say. I just simply note the fact that that the person you're referring to was testified before the Senate several weeks ago, where he described himself as a social engineer who had worked as a private investigator for several years. It's my understanding that that's why the FBI became interested in him in 1993. So I think the sort of the heart of your question is that Kevin's problem was me.
No, that's
And
not. That's not it.
I
It's
beg to
that
differ
you
with you.
printed false things about him and haven't retracted them and haven't backed them up. That's my question. It's very simple.
I beg to differ with you. I did not print false things about him.
So you are claiming now that Kevin Mitnick broke into NORAD.
I think that's what you said.
Well, that's what you said in your article.
The NORAD point is an interesting one. My source on NORAD was Stephen Rhodes. And Stephen Rhodes told me that in an interview. Stephen Rhodes, in case you don't know, was a friend of Kevin's, in the late 1970s and early 80s. And that fact actually was reported earlier than I had reported it in the LA Times. But I don't think that's what the issue is, really. I think the issue is what was going on in the fall of 1993 while he was on probation, when he attracted the attention ultimately of 4 law enforcement agencies. Why do you think he did that?
Why did he want to attract
Why were
attention?
4 law enforcement agencies interested in what he was doing?
Might have had something to do with your front page article.
Now, the question is,
More or
was
less,
it the story in the
why-
New York Times in 1994, in July of 1994, which was Kevin's problem, or was it what Kevin was doing?
Well-
and I believe it was what he was doing.
Well, what I'd like to know is then why was the reporter who was following him also actively participating in the investigation?
That's
Joe
inaccurate.
Orszak was reported in 2 books, 2 separate books. Joe Orzak's cellular technician said
That was
they
inaccurate.
used their car. So 2 books
That
are
was
both
inaccurate.
wrong. Joe Orszak made it up.
That's not what Joe Orszak said.
What about when
Okay.
you talked to John Littman?
I think we've
Marianne,
had one.
you
We've
told
had
John Littman.
we've had one question and we've had one answer. May we have the next question, please?
Hi, my name is Steve Abel. One of the things that interests me a lot in life is the nature of the word interest. Now, since I'm inside this world, I tend to mistrust my perceptions, but is it your perception that the eccentricity level in our field is high? And what is it that makes the Phil Spiras and the Cliff Stalls of the world come into this stuff and stick so hard? Why are we here? And where are all the normal people?
Does anybody know a normal person?
Well, I guess that's maybe directed at me, and I guess I ought to... It's weird to say it, but I consider myself, by and large, within a couple sigma of normal. And I say that with a straight face. It's real easy to do, anyone in this room can describe things that she's done that are just completely weird. We don't think of the jillions of things that we do that are utterly mainstream. But having said that, I thought I'd scribble. Oh yeah. It bears on something I wrote in my hand earlier, but I'll point it out right now. Somebody called me up 6 months, a year ago, talking about how come I'm not tracking down this hacker? Why am I not cooperating in tracking down these people doing denial of service blitz? And every few months, there's this computer crack or computer hacker escapade going on. People call me up and I say, "Not interested, chum." And they say, "Well, why not?" I say, "The first time you do something, it's science. The second time, it's engineering. I'm a scientist. The first time I caught a hacker, hey, it was research. The second time, not interested anymore."
Okay, next question, please.
Good evening to the panel here. Enjoyed your talk, each one of you. My question is, does it impress you guys that if you look over the whole history of the ARPANET and computing and so forth, that really industry has been sort of going for a free ride on academia and science, and the fact is that when business finally gets a hold of the technology, which is 20 years old, they don't add enough to it to make it viable for business, and so that's why we have all the problems we have. And then when people like ourselves, I'm guilty as charged. I've never worked in academia really. I've always worked for businesses like DEC and Xerox and stuff. When we try to speak up and say something about it, no, we can't afford to do that. Does that happen? Does it sound familiar to you guys? And I wanted your impressions on this scenario, and in particular, don't you think it would be cool, like if people like Cisco and the other router companies actually put something in so you can find out where the packets are really coming from? Am I silly because of the fact that, I mean, is there some sort of huge technological problem where we can't do this over like 10, 15 years? We can't find out where, I mean, impressions, please.
You forgot to credit the military.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my prejudice.
I agree. Whatever your question was, I'm not sure what it was, but your statement. Yeah.
Well, the question is, do you guys agree with that, and have you noticed that yourselves, and along with
I think the answer
the
is-
internet, the ARPANET, was designed as a terrifically wonderful system that worked during the Age of Innocence, and sort of it's okay for the demands being placed on it today, but there are major warts in it that people hardly ever talk about. For example, there's no billing algorithm built into it. I mean, it's absurd that something that we're paying for, there's no way to properly allocate, who's using it per byte, per kilometer, per minute. It's designed with security sort of buttered onto it rather than built into it. I thoroughly agree.
Well, there's several comments here. One is that the ARPANET was a research vehicle for DoD. I remember years ago twitting Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn about the fact that yes, they were doing a lot with alternative routing, but they weren't really doing a lot with end-to-end reliability and end-to-end security. And the answer was always, well, security is NSA's problem, and we can't get into that. There's some serious problems that resulted, obviously, from that. But if you think about the denial of service problem, even the most draconian security measures tend not to stop it unless you have end-to-end authentication and callback and handshaking all over the net, which would slow it down by a factor of...
Deny everybody service.
Deny everybody service, right. And so I think from a practical point of view, the fact that the internet, the ARPANET before it, were not very secure was not totally unrealistic at the time, with the belief that if you really were worried, you'd use end-to-end encryption. Now, the problem is that doesn't solve the denial of service problem.
Makes it much worse.
That's where the deterrence comes from, the ability to trace the packets to their real source. That's why I mentioned that.
Okay. May I?
No, those remarks that you made were summarized before your birth by Bertolt Brecht, who said, "What crime is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank?"
Next question, please.
I guess I'm not exactly clear how to phrase my question. It's more of a feeling of that I mean, I think the one speaker spoke to this, but the characterization of computer crime and the idea of black hats and white hats, it seems like what we're forgetting a lot in this is that what we're really dealing here with is with social issues, and where I understand Cliff's feeling about the feeling of invasion of self when somebody breaks into your computer, and I feel, for myself, the personal inconvenience of the loss of time of recovering from an incident, which I've had to do in the past. It really seems, though, is this black and white sort of character that we've given things making us view things that are really just, rude things to do and inconsiderate, and that would, in a normal society, in the society we interact within and shake hands in, cause us to merely dislike somebody, to refer to them badly, that we're instead turning into prosecution and putting it into this legal system, which is, as it seems, is a form of protecting us. I mean, I don't want to talk too long on this, but my real question is, do we feel that we're, by seeing it as crime and punishment, as we're sort of viewing the issue rather one-sided, where it's really a societal problem that often is more of things that are merely rude and not actually evil, as it's sometimes been characterized?
I think that's a very apt comment. Haven't read Dostoevsky in the last few years. Might be worth going back to it.
The question here, I think, was, is it a social problem that we technologists are trying to solve, and where are the sociologists?
Now there's a risk all by itself. I think one of our biggest faults is that we try to solve technological problems socially and social problems technologically. If you look at filtering and spamming and all this stuff, Congress is very quick to pass.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Next question.
Evening. It's funny that we just talked about social. I was a social scientist before I became an engineer, so that's a whole other story. My question is, well, actually, some of you have addressed this as being no crime. We're really not committing a crime. We're doing reverse engineering. How do we approach the new generation of, I don't want to use hackers, but the malicious users that are these 17-year-old kids that are taking advantage of somebody else's reverse engineering that's readily made available on the internet, which is then used to go ahead and do something malicious. Should there be any responsibility placed on the people that are making that type of code available to the new generation of attackers on the internet?
Okay. What about the next generation? And we can do something about it in the United States, but with 300 million and 189 countries, each with its own culture, how do we deal with this?
I guess I don't see it as a problem of a new generation or 17-year-olds. No, I see a great deal of promise and joy in 17-year-olds and a capability to do things right that previous generations haven't. No, the distribution of people doing good, bad, and questionably, I'm not sure which that is, I think is uniformly distributed amongst generations and ages.
It would be interesting to see, I guess there was a question asked earlier of the audience, how many of you are recidivists, or how many of you have in fact been crackers, hackers, smackers, snackers, whatever, at some point in your careers. But there is a certain benefit if you really wanted to know computer security. There's a certain benefit to having had a mentality where you were able to break things. And when you come to the conclusion that those things shouldn't have been broken, or breakable, rather, sorry, they shouldn't have been breakable. They should have been designed better in the first place. You begin to wonder. Now, the DVD thing was presumably intentionally designed to be very weak so that they could prosecute. Think about that one for a minute.
No, I think they just didn't care. It wasn't a priority for the people who designed it.
Yeah. Well, the problem is a big enough hammer, you can break anything.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
Okay. I'm interested, actually, Witt's talk was kind of interesting. My big hot button is computer crimes of perception, where we read in the paper how in Hong Kong they bust some street dealer who's just got 5,000 copies of Microsoft Word he's been selling for $1. And how this represents $500,000 of Microsoft software. And yet, if you were priced at retail, no one in Hong Kong would buy Microsoft software. Yeah. So it's really only $5,000. And yet it is presented as a large crime. And when you have something like all these neat cell phones, which are going to have by the year 2001 a way of locating every cell phone where it is for 911 purposes, supposed to be good for you. So my definition of computer crime is whenever a legitimate corporation doesn't benefit from it, it's a crime. And that has nothing to do with justice and legality. So my question for the panel was, is there some way we can come up with an objective definition of the victim? You know, who was harmed in a computer crime?
Occasionally law enforcement gets it right in the long run. The Craig Nydorf case was a wonderful example where the baby Bell went after Nydorf, told the Justice Department that this was a heinous crime and that it was worth millions and millions of dollars, until the judge discovered that they were selling the document for whatever it was, a handful of dollars. This is a very serious problem, I think, that you've raised, and there's no easy answer to it.
Okay, Thank you very much for the questions and for our panel. I hope it was valuable.
Sorry about that.